Hi, everyone, and welcome to Mergers and Acquisitions, a podcast by the Society for Economic Anthropology. My name is Aneil and as part of our series on climate change and economic anthropology, I'm very excited to talk today with Thomas Reuter. Reuter is a professorial fellow at the Asia Institute of the University of Melbourne in Australia, currently based in Germany and affiliated with the Southeast Asia Institute. After obtaining his PhD from Australia National University, he taught at Heidelberg University and then returned to Australia for several fellowships at the University of Melbourne, a Monash Research Fellowship, and an ARC Future Fellowship and Professorship. He was president of the Australian Anthropological Association from 2002 to 2005, chair of the World Council of Anthropological Associations, senior vice president of the International Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences. Reuter has been an expert advisor to IPBES and IPCC, and a member of the board of Future Earth Asia. He is a trustee of the World Academy of Art and Science, a fellow of the European Academy of Science and Academia Europaea. His research in Indonesia and beyond is focused on indigenous people, social movements, religion, political elites, ecology, climate change, food security, and globalization. Professor Reuter has published 15 books and over 150 articles. And one of those over 150 articles is now Climate Change as Cultural Artifact: Anthropological Insights to Help Avert Systemic Collapse, in Economic Anthropology's recent symposium issue, centered on the question, what does economic anthropology contribute to the understanding of climate change? So thanks so much for joining me today, Professor Reuter.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for your kind introduction. Altogether too long, but
That's a
I
great
guess,
list.
After many years of practice as an academic, you have your track record grows.
That's the way it goes. Since this is a podcast for the Society of Economic Anthropology, my first question shouldn't be too much of a surprise. What does economic anthropology mean to you?
Well, I see it, first of all, relative to economics as it is generally understood. Economic anthropology is a critique of that mainstream perspective on economy. We look at it from a comparative perspective, which means that we see that different societies across time, across different cultures, have developed different forms of economy. There are some fundamental tasks that any economy has to fulfill, namely to distribute resources efficiently from where they are in abundance to where they are needed, to facilitate exchange, and so on. But in order to solve that basic problems or meet that basic human need, there are many, many different ways of doing it. Often mainstream economists forget that our way of doing economics in the West is not the way. And I think everyone should know that after Marshall Sahlins' Stone Age economics, for example, which shows just how different an economy can be from what we experience as normal. Now, the problem is that the sort of standard Western perspective, which is a historically, culturally embedded perspective of economics, it has become globalized in the process of, the age of colonialism and imperialism. So in some ways, it's acquired a certain universality, figures such as, GDP, there isn't a national economy that doesn't consider GDP, no matter how flawed a measure it may be. There's much debate about that now, but even so, there is diversity, the way people do business culture, also the legal framework still differs from one country to the next. So anthropology continues to be able to provide a good critical comparative perspective on what economics is and can be. It can be very different. And the way, even if it looks similar, it can still be different.
And I think in your response, what was really nice to pick up on was your perspective on critique and framing economic anthropology as a critique of economics that opens up alternatives, that allows us to see other possibilities, both in terms of ways to distribute and manage resources, but also in terms of thinking about when we practice economics or our management of materials, thinking about what is the reason we're actually doing that, as a focus in economic anthropology, and something that through critique we can really open up. What are people actually doing when they're thinking about acting as economic actors?
Yeah, it makes us aware that we are in our routine way of doing things, we're actually making a choice. We've forgotten that we're choosing to do things in a certain way and that they could be different. And that really opens up opportunities. You're quite right, yeah.
And for sure, trying to open up differences or other possibilities of acting is incredibly important when we think about responding to climate change. Building off of the last question, how do you think economic anthropology helps us understand and respond to climate change?
I sort of see climate change as the biggest market failure of all times, basically, where you've had companies and also individuals, producing externalities for which they are not paying. So nobody's paying the cost for the damage that these activities have produced, namely activities that involve carbon emissions, energy consumption primarily, but also materials that require energy, say aluminium or concrete. So we have all these practices that produce externalities that are not paid for. So it's a market failure. The market fails to price that in, okay? At least until now, that has been the case because there is a lack of regulation. We're required to do that, so we didn't. Coming back to what I said earlier about the diversity of economic systems, I think in my recent article for economic anthropology, I try to point out that if you look at human societies before, say, the 1940s or so, it varies a bit, probably a bit earlier in the US, a bit later, maybe 60s in Europe. Our consumption was not as unsustainable as it is now by any means. People lived much simpler lives. We didn't have the same, consumer society. The US probably, it happened a bit earlier, but that doesn't matter. The point is that until fairly recently, we didn't have the kind of overconsumption and the vast carbon emissions that we have now. If you look at the graphs of any kind, or all the indicators, whether it's for climate change or marine pollution, they all look like hockey sticks. And the takeoff point is around the 60s, when it really takes off. And then you can look at where the sort of the more moderate curve starts, and you see, well, it's maybe maybe 1850 or so, the beginning, industrial revolution, or when it really took hold. The age of coal and steam, and it began then, but even that is only a few hundred years. It's nothing really. If you step back and you look at 200,000 years of Homo sapiens, or 250,000, then you sort of say, well, that's just the blink of an eye. And until then, we lived sustainably. What happened? And you sort of are then more able to question this current way of life that we have, question the idea that it is necessary or inevitable, that it's natural. It's not natural. We've become this. We chose to become it, or we slid into it through a process of cultural change. And that means we can also exit it. And the same cross-culturally, if you look at economies in other countries, you find that they're much more sustainable. They haven't contributed much to climate change. One good way to see the relationship to the sort of modern industrialized society, the connection between that and climate change and other indicators, is the Human Development Index. And you can see that the rate of development and GDP is heavily correlated with the amount of the carbon footprint. It is the global spread of that way of life that is really causing the problem. And many countries, many societies, many social groups, even in the West, do not consume above planetary limits or contribute greatly to climate change. If you look at carbon emissions, it's maybe 1% of humanity accounts for a very, very large part of it. I don't remember the figure offhand, but it's most of it. It's not like some kind of God-given, disaster, some biblical disaster from up high. It's something we've created, and we must develop with economic anthropology that kind of reflexive awareness that allows us to step back and say, oh, well, we can choose differently. We really can. There is nothing inevitable about this. When I talk about this sort of sense of inevitability, I'm thinking particularly of the sort of neoliberal doctrine that began with the Reagan-Thatcher era in the early 80s, and has become a sort of a doctrine, or it's not really an item of faith. This faith in the market, deregulation, financialization, globalization, all that. And there's this sort of idea that if you say anything against that, you must have no idea about economics at all. You're a heretic. You're excommunicated. And this is still taught, even though at the sort of elite level, if you talk about economics to people in the World Academy or so, or the Club of Rome, and these sort of peak sort of bodies or intellectual leaders, and nobody there believes in that fairy tale anymore. But it's still taught in many economics departments today around the world, these sort of assumptions, and it's just plain wrong. It's plain wrong to think that you can have an economy without regulations, an economy without moral foundations. It's just not possible. It doesn't work. It has to, in order to be sustainable as a system, its main stakeholders and participants must be at least somewhat satisfied and catered for their needs. Otherwise, the economy is not doing what an economy should do. You can have those kinds of systems in a state of distortion or tension, but it doesn't last forever. And this time we have a situation where, for the first time, it's not just about us, about human beings and our welfare and our about social justice, but it's also about environmental justice. It's about our relationship to the Earth system, which we're now changing even at the physical level. So we really can't go on like that. And I must say, I'm very pleased that even just the last year, there's a public discourse or the edifice of the neoliberal perspective on things, which is really it's based on vested interests. It's not that suited certain people, and benefited certain people, but it's crumbling everywhere. You look at Biden's policies now that are coming out and trying to address some of the issues that arose from that policy, increasing inequality, increasing environmental damage. It's no longer such a strong edifice. You're no longer considered a heretic if you say that this system doesn't work anymore. It's now okay to speak about it. Say in the World Bank, I was at the World Bank in a meeting last year with the World Academy on the future of finance, and it's very much now being discussed. That we need a different way, and we can draw inspiration from the way economy has been done in other cultures.
What strikes me in your response is also how much of kind of grappling with climate change and also with grappling with this neoliberal economics system that's dominated the logic and the planning of so many countries for the last several decades is really a lot of issues in terms of human individual experience, community experience, and then trying to make sense of these very different scales, right? As you mentioned, how our scale of consumption has gone up dramatically, and then also thinking about the increased impact of climate change. And I think in your article in Economic Anthropology, I really like how you lay out and, in a sense, draw from philosophers, draw from political scientists to think about and really come to this idea of a moral ecology, which I think seems to grapple with both the scale of different environmental and social systems and trying to find a way, in a sense, to break through and really become aware of what are the things that are motivating people, right? And how can we put that in connection with or in greater harmony with larger ecological systems?
Yes, that's right. You mentioned the whole idea of moral economy, and that's a concept that was developed by the English historian E.P. Thompson, and then later popularized in anthropology by James Scott, who wrote this book, I think it was in 1976, The Moral Economy of the Peasant. And by moral economy, Scott meant the way in which economic needs, and especially basic needs, are sort of socially experienced as a pattern of moral rights or expectation. So he says that economics somewhere is rooted in culture and even in religion. And also Karl Polanyi argued similarly that economics in undertakings are always embedded within social and cultural contexts. So there's always a moral dimension and a social dimension. It's about relationships. And I mean, in this anthropology, from the sort of idea of exchange theory. So an exchange is a way of establishing a relationship, a very basic way of establishing relationship. Imagine you want to establish a relationship with another species, say a parrot or so, a wild parrot. I'm thinking of that because living in Australia, we have a lot of wild parrots and we do very much have a relationship with them. And how does it work? Exchange. You offer them some seed or so and they start to relate to you. You are a person to them, you are a meaningful part of their world. You have a social relationships with them because you've entered into an exchange. They're very intelligent birds, by the way. So I'm really not exaggerating by saying that you enter into a relationship with them. This is getting off the topic, but perhaps not, because we talk now about interspecies relationships, our relationships with nature, which means living nature most of all, and on which we utterly depend, and we are an integral part of that. So economics is not just relationship between humans, but it's all relationships that we have with the world. Completely. It's all exchange. Every breath we take is a physical exchange. Every sound we make is a physical event, so I think if it really comes down to systems thinking, and you have to start to think, how do systems maintain their balance? They're always, in a way, tipping. They're always off balance, tipping one way and then making a correction, and it's never perfect. So they're tipping another way and they're making another correction. And at the moment, we've been tipping for a while. We need a really big correction, and it requires a lot of awareness, a raising of awareness. Perhaps COVID has shaken us up a bit and woken us up a bit about the potential impact of external shocks, and climate change is going to be massive external shock. It already is for a lot of people in, say, sub-Saharan Africa. We're now facing the biggest famine in decades in the wake of COVID, combined with climate change impacts, also political problems in some countries.
No, for sure. One point that I think would be interesting to get your opinion on there, thinking about multi-species relationships or interspecies relationships. Another issue in terms of the environmental devastation that we've seen is the extreme biodiversity loss, the loss of species that we've even really come to understand or come into interaction with that much directly. Thinking then also about systems theory and how do we respond to the scale of the magnitude of the problem that we have with climate change. It's interesting, as you noted, right, in the World Bank, in an increasing number of forums, we have more discussion about how the system is not working and how we need to shift things and to take other impacts into account in our kind of global and kind of planning across countries. And I think we have seen some shifts, but then even in the Paris Agreement, you have some acknowledgements of the rights of indigenous communities, of really trying to take into account other environmental impact. But there is also seemingly kind of a baked in focus on continued development, in that even in, for instance, in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Modeling, when I was talking with Professor McElwee on our last interview, she was discussing how so many of the IPCC modeling is based on planting forests and doing kind of carbon emissions that really seems to limit the possibilities that are available to us in terms of trying to conserve and preserve biodiversity in certain places. So do you see any real challenges there in terms of how far can we push the windows that we have right now in terms of people having alternative thinking? Because sometimes it seems we get into these cases, right, where there's some acceptance to have more open-mindedness in terms of how do we build more sustainably, but then the sustainability itself is fairly narrow and actually might encourage more development and consumption.
Yeah, well, it's tough, it's tough to, remember many years ago, I wrote an article about change resistance in relation to climate change. The problem is that we inhabit worlds, we're dwellers of particular worlds, and anthropology really brings that realization home. So we live in this world, it has certain features, certain rules, we have our habits, we function in that. And somebody tries to say, well, all that has to change, that world has to change. people feel like someone is trying to kill them because it's their life support, it's their everything. So if you're talking about system change, people get really nervous.
Yeah.
They feel threatened, they're frightened. At the same time, I think everybody on the planet can feel that things are not right. Okay, you just feel it. You feel it sort of viscerally in your body. You feel there's something not right. And it may not be conscious even, but it's still there. Something in us registers. Change in climate, for example, change in nature. It's hard not to. I mean, I live in Germany at the moment. It's a temperate climate here. You think, wow, who cares, 2 degrees? But we've just, in the span of 2 years, we've lost in this region 70% of our forest cover. Why? Because monocultures, climate change, drought, astronomical growth or in the population of certain bark-boring beetles, and finish, bang, gone. Now, you talk about people, whether they're educated or not, they have a sense that things are not right, things are not going well in relation to social justice. That's another crisis stemming from the same attitude, really, the sort of reckless attitude. And yet we are kind of married to this world, okay? Any change to it is a big style change is threatening, and people will become defensive if there isn't a process to sort of to have a narrative. You need a narrative that addresses the problems that people can feel, and at the same time offers an opportunity in a new way of living. We need a new narrative and a new meta-narrative, a new cultural meta-narrative that, for example, says that, well, okay, you can buy a lousy piece of furniture every 3 years, or you can buy one really good piece of furniture that lasts for 10 generations. Is that a bad thing? Is that a great loss? We mustn't sort of slip into this idea that consuming less is necessarily bad. Or take meat as an example. Okay, we cannot consume meat on the scale that we have. We cannot afford, the Chinese middle class taking on Western habits in terms of meat consumption. The planet won't take it. Okay? It's just not going to happen. But is that terrible? Well, not necessarily. Maybe if you eat half or a third of the meat that you do now, and it's much better quality, it's produced in a way that's compassionate to other species, that doesn't produce million cubic meters of really quite dangerous effluent that's poisoning groundwater and so on. Is that so bad? I mean, you have to make people kind of like the change. And that's really difficult. I think that's where we're falling short. Interestingly, if you look at cross-cultural comparisons of happiness or people's sense of wellness, it's not that well correlated with consumption. It doesn't actually make people happy. We've got $1 trillion advertising industry telling us that it does, but it doesn't. That's actually not true. It's amazing to see some countries like Bhutan or Sikkim in the Himalayas or Costa Rica, and what they're doing to kind of reset their system on a moral foundation, moral in the interhuman relations and in the relations with nature.
And I think that really highlights how there's a real role for anthropologists to be on the ground, talking directly with people, trying to make sense of what actually are desires that people have that could go into a new cultural meta-narrative or kind of a guiding structure at a larger level.
Often the new is also the old, Give you an example, my current research project is on food systems in Indonesia. That's my current sort of on-the-ground ethnographic research. And what you get there is you have traditional food systems. For example, in the highlands of Bali, where I did my PhD research, I saw that system still functioning pretty well in the early 90s. And I also saw it collapse. So they had mixed gardens where they had like more than 200 plant species in every individual garden. Can you imagine the biodiversity, the food biodiversity? These gardens, they looked like a jungle to someone who didn't understand. They were so diverse, and yet everything there was actually cultivated, very light touch kind of way.
That's awesome.
Very healthy environment, healthy food, fresh food, all kinds of enzymes, not just carbohydrates and fats and sugars, but everything you could wish for in your diet. People didn't have any non-communicable diseases to speak of. Then they moved to cash crops, big shift economically. They moved to cash crops, produced first coffee, then largely citrus fruit, but you can't live just on citrus fruit. So what do? They actually had to start to buy food. What do they buy? The most horrible junk food you can possibly imagine, full of, the regulations are weak in Indonesia, so full of artificial colors and all kinds of chemicals that are not even allowed anymore in Europe or in the States. So, okay, what's the consequence? Well, the ecosystem is ruined, people's health is ruined, everybody's got diabetes and heart attacks and cardiovascular disease, you name it. So you get this sort of total system collapse, the people, the environment, everything, the social problems, some winners, many, many losers. And then you get to a point where, it doesn't work anymore. And then people start to think, oh, well, how did we used to do it? And, how about, we never bought, fertilizers and Roundup, and herbicide, glyphosate, it's called Roundup. Yeah. How did we used to do it? And they start to think, and they start to worry, and then now you get these counter movements. You mentioned earlier, one of my long-term interests is social movements. So then now we have a social movement that wants to restore food systems, ecosystems, and communities all at once. And I've been studying a farmers movement that does exactly that, and they do amazing work. And not so much in Bali. In Bali, it's still starting, when in Java, it's strong and very innovative. Truly, we can learn a lot from those farmers. So if you ask me, where do I get hope on this very kind of dismal sort of crisis situation that we have, and the short time frame for change, it's there at the local level where people sort of combining things that they remember from the old days, and modern technology and marketing direct to consumers through mobile phone apps, and at the same time using organic agriculture. So there are lots of people working towards solutions at the local level, and that's where anthropologists operate and can report back and help to disseminate those ideas.
Completely.
That's a challenge. It's not
not
scale,
that easy.
Scale is the real problem. One thing I'm doing to try to achieve that is I'm working on building with a team of people on a platform called the Sustainable Action Platform, and it's like a compendium of ideas, of tested and tried ideas from and for local actors across all sectors. That's a way to share that knowledge, and some of it will come from developing countries. Yeah.
How do you see your current research and your work on this project as the culmination point of your years of earlier fieldwork? It must be really exciting to see kind of maybe perhaps agricultural practices you had seen earlier, be having a resurgence. Are there any other points where you've seen both the situation change in your field sites and also your perspective or the way you were thinking about processing?
Yeah, it's really quite remarkable. I should be here talking about economic anthropology, because in my younger days, I considered myself an idealist, philosophically speaking. I wasn't so particularly interested in material exchange. I thought it was overrated, too much brain power wasted on that. And I decided in my PhD to study symbolic economy. So I had a kind of economic approach, following Bourdieu and, the idea of symbolic capital, cultural capital, social capital, and so on, Bourdieu and others. I wanted to look at the symbolic, so there again, you have an exchange system, an economy in that sense, but it's a symbolic economy, and the commodity is status. So it's entirely social, symbolic. That's what I focused on. And I deliberately ignored the economic economy. Well, I think my fieldwork was good enough to luckily that I have plenty of notes on the economic economy, but I never wrote about it, never gave it much thought at the time. And it's only much later that I sort of thought, oh, I have to balance out, life is an eternal quest for balance. And
completely.
So if you're strong on one thing and you like it, well, after a while, it probably pays to look at the opposite and see what you're missing. So I think I had a big turn. A colleague of mine, Craig McRae, was a big part in that. He inspired that. We've always had very heated debates. He was from a long time back. He was interested in farming, in economic, political ecology. So we had heated battles over, the relative importance of these. And now we kind of met halfway, and that's good. That's good. I think that's a good sign generally, if you can overcome your own preferences and have a more neutral, colorless attitude. Nothing to sell, no preconceptions. In the course of my career meant, looking at what other disciplines were doing. And I think it's important not to be a jack of all trades, to learn your own trade well and to go deep. But at a certain point, I think it's legitimate to sort of say, well, how about I do some historical work? How about I do some politics, political science? For example, I had a project on Indonesia's national elite because, first of all, because I had the connections to get access, and I saw the need. So I did it. I moved into basically political science, but as an anthropologist. The kind of political science that I did was very different. Yeah. And the kind of economics I do is also very different because I am an anthropologist.
And I think that's an interesting thing that seems to happen to so many anthropologists, right? Is we have this perspective from our discipline, and then a lot of how our work develops is really dependent on where we find ourselves through happenstance and through, what projects are available or the ideas that are dominating our perspective, as you were saying, about kind of more symbolic economy versus material. And then our research develops from there. One thing that also struck me, looking back on your kind of career, it seems you've done quite a lot of work in anthropological associations, and in a sense, like the organizing, right, of anthropologists in a variety of settings, both in Australia and other global forums. How did that work develop? And are there any tips that you've learned over the years in terms of how we can collaborate?
Well, that's very important. I think it was per chance. It so happened that I was the president of the Australian Anthropological Society at a time when a very good friend of mine, Gustavo Ribeiro from Brazil, got some funding from the Venegren Foundation to bring the presidents of 14 national associations together to talk about how they might collaborate. And Gustavo and some of his colleagues involved with a project called World Anthropology that basically says that Anglo-American, for that matter, Australian anthropology has been very dominant, and there are other anthropologies out there, other national traditions or regional traditions also, that are invisible because those anthropologists publish in Spanish or in Portuguese or in Russian or Chinese or Arabic, and they're just invisible. They're not part of the corpus. We wanted to overcome that. We wanted also more collaboration between anthropologists in different countries. I then spoke with Gustavo, and we decided to propose to the group that we form an organization, which then became the World Council of Anthropological Associations. It now has, I think, about close to 60 members, 60 national associations. So it's huge. It's joint membership of those associations, like, I don't know, over 100,000 anthropologists, and covers a very large number of the total number of anthropologists in the world. So it's got very good reach, very strong democratic foundations. Everybody's an equal voice, whether it's the Association of Portugal or the AAA or ABA from Brazil or the Australian Association. Everyone has got one vote, one voice, and there's a very strong sense of collaboration and equality. And I think it's an important step in decolonizing the discipline and bringing the diversity or the perspective into the discipline itself in a sort of self-reflexive manner. I never forget when we admitted the Tunisian National Association of Anthropology to the WCAA, and the representative gave a sort of a maiden speech conference in New Delhi. He was talking about the tradition of anthropology in the Arabic world, and I just couldn't believe how absolutely blind I had been to this tradition. Like most anthropologists in the Western context, I had no idea. And this, I mean, we're talking about hundreds of years of texts that very much you can trace it. You know, you can track a sort of a pedigree of anthropological thought from the perspective of the Arab world. Amazing, truly amazing. And it's a pity. Oh, how much do you know about Polish anthropology? Well, it turns out there is quite a lot to know. You know, and I think that's really helped to internationalize anthropology, to relativize our practice as anthropologists, as belonging in national traditions. And there's nothing wrong with the American or the British tradition or any other French, which have been, because they've been dominant, but there's so much more, you know.
Have you noticed any differences in working in collaborations across disciplines versus when you were trying to organize anthropologists from different countries and in different traditions? Are there any similarities or particular points?
The next thing that happened then was that WCAA and IAS nominated me to represent anthropology on the International Social Science Council, which is peak body of science. And I was on the executive, basically with other social scientists. I then went through the experience of the International Social Science Council merging with ICSU, which is a natural sciences, to form the ISC, which is now the unified body for all scientific disciplines, you know, social or natural. So I went through that process of integration with them. So in a way, I've kind of had this interesting trajectory of broadening out. Obviously, I've also sought that and wanted that.
Yeah.
But I've learned a lot, and now sort of a lot of my work is in the World Academy, and that's totally interdisciplinary and intersectoral. So we have artists there, so like famous artists, and we have business people, policy people, NGO leaders, politicians. I don't know. It's just security experts, everything. So it's really totally forget. Nobody cares where you come from. It's what you have to say and what you can add, you know, in the effort to address, you know, major challenges. Great trajectory, but I'm glad that you know, I came at it as an anthropologist, and I must say that I moved into these interdisciplinary, intersectoral contexts, and people really value anthropology. We often don't realize, but we are looked upon rather favorably because we do serious research that earns us a lot of respect. We know the languages, we know, you know, we really invest seriously into understanding something. And we have this systems perspective. We look at culture as a whole, you know, as a complex of ideas and actions and relationships. And that's the order of the day, or the call of the day, is to think systems. And we are very well prepared for that. So anthropology is, you might say, in vogue. It's come into its moment. You know, we are in the Anthropocene. The demand for reflexivity reflexivity about our own human nature and our place in the world has never been greater and more acute than now.
And similarly to what we were saying earlier about how sustainable development or the Paris Agreement, how there has to be this process of slowly or trying to adjust people to another narrative. And of course, as you were saying, people can get very anxious in this process. And similarly, now we're at this moment where there's a demand for a real kind of desire by so many groups for an increased reflexivity. Are there other tips or perspectives that you've learned in terms of how, as anthropologists, we can translate some of our ideas or certain strategies that make our perspectives more accessible or available to people, as similarly to, as you just said, the fact that we do field work as being a really supportive thing to ground our research and its value? Are there other strategies?
Scaling is enormously difficult. And that's, I think, a lot of the time we learn things as anthropologists and it's kind of stuck in a box because you can't take it out. You take it out and it no longer makes any sense. It's like fairy gold, you know.
Yeah.
You know, you wake up and you look at it and it's just mud or rocks or something, you know. It looked like you had found this treasure, but that's because translation is so difficult, let alone transferring knowledge so that it will work somewhere else. But it is possible. And if you go about it in a smart way, if you take a piece of knowledge, and you take it to another culture, there's got to be enough commonality for it to work. I'll give you an example. I was working with these amazing farmers in Indonesia. They received an invitation through La Via Campesina, which is a small farmers global organization, to go to Vietnam and show them how they grow rice in an organic way. And they funded this, and a select group of farmers went over there for 6 months, or a whole season, growing season, and saw them through the whole process. Every day, living there, eating with them, sleeping in their houses, full experience. Yeah. And in the first season, they almost doubled their yield, and with organic methods. So they were just over the moon, They said they didn't want to let them go, They said, "Oh, stay another 6 months, stay another year." They said, "No, we have to go back to our families." But you can see what I mean. It's real commitment. If you want to help knowledge travel, it requires real commitment. Interestingly, they were asked to go to Italy. There wasn't much overlap, but some really strange thing happened. They work a lot with microorganisms in Indonesia, these farmers. They're really smart at using microorganisms for all kinds of things. So they were taken to a pig farm. They are Muslims, okay? They were taken to a pig farm in Italy, and they said, "Oh, this just stinks. It's terrible. How can you bear it? Why don't you do something about it?" I said, "Well, it's pigs. I'm sorry, but that's what it's like." They said, "Well, no, it shouldn't be like that." So they went on a hunt around the local environment in Italy, and after a few days and a few little tubs with samples and experiments, lo and behold, they had found a microorganism on vine leaves, which are abundant in Italy, that got rid of the smell and the toxicity also. That's a small piece, but because it's a general skill, working with microorganisms, it's less specialized than rice growing, it's more mobile. So it depends on the kind of knowledge it is too.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example too of learning and knowledge sharing through doing, which I think interestingly maps onto our own method of understanding in anthropology, right? Of participant observation. And actually trying to do, for instance, in my field work, I was also working in climate finance to actually try to understand what are the words and perspectives that people have in this space. And I think that also working in this space has been the main avenue for me that I've actually been able to even share and expand and reflect on anthropology and talk to people working in climate finance about what value anthropology has in this space. It's through actually working. I couldn't really have an effect if I just came to this group without any background and just said, "I'm an anthropologist and I'm going to tell you all of these things." Participant observation opens that space.
Yeah, I think when you're presented with a practical problem, it brings out knowledge in you that you didn't know you had. I often found that as an anthropologist, certain resources that I'm hardly aware of, I don't think much about, and then there's a problem, and suddenly, oh, well, I do have an idea. Where do those ideas come from? A lot of it comes from that rich experience of field work. I said before that the world is reaching a sort of an anthropological moment through globalization. We're all confronted with different cultures, with having to question the worlds we inhabit and the way we live our world. And as an anthropologist, of course, you go through that very deep experience of suspending your own world and entering into another. And after sort of a year and a half or so, you get to a point where you can no longer maintain your old ways. If you want to function as a human being in the community there, you have to adopt their way. And then you come back and you have to adjust once again. You have a culture shock, and you go through all this psychological process, and it loosens your relationship with any particular worldview. You can think about something in two different ways, and you realize, well, there may be more than two. So you have a sort of a metacultural understanding, and you bring that to any task. You can always put yourself out of the frame a bit as an anthropologist, and that's a fantastic skill to have.
Over your career as well, I think right earlier you were reflecting on how you were more kind of symbolic economy minded, but then you still had some field notes, luckily, on the material processes that were going on. Have you changed your methods in particularly very conscious ways in response to new questions that we were thinking about?
Yeah, I think my methods have changed tremendously, but they weren't bad to start with. I think I received pretty good training. That's why I felt like I had to note certain things down, even though they didn't interest me so much, because I was raised in that tradition of doing a holistic fieldwork. That means everything is interesting. Everything's interesting, and then you select what interests you to write your thesis, but the rest is still there on record somewhere as a resource. That's sort of holistic ethnography. So that was a pretty good starting point. But now, as you sort of move on, you have less time in the field usually. Yeah, time in the field is often very precious, and you have to move fast. And you get smart in finding information and making the right connections to people, leveraging the relationships you have, using the language skills you've built up. Everything becomes faster and easier. If you look at you have different projects, different problems, your methods have to adjust. But it's always an add-on or extension, an organic process. Let's say when I started that elite project, I had to find ways to access ministers and generals and, religious leaders and celebrities. And, it's not something I'd been in the habit of doing. But yeah, I had to develop those skills. But I had certain people's skills from my previous fieldwork, which did help me. Always maintain that, you shouldn't study anyone if you can't have empathy for them, if you can't put yourself into their position. You don't have to agree with them, but if you can't have that openness, you shouldn't be doing it.
That's a really great point. It reminds me, I've been reading this book recently by Timothy Pacharat called Among Wolves, Ethnography and the Immersive Study of Power. And what you're talking about in terms of when you started looking at people with much more power than the farmers you were initially doing your fieldwork with.
Much more than me, too.
Yeah, and yourself, exactly. No, that's a really big topic for me because I was doing fieldwork amongst, financiers in kind of an NGO space. So I was also seeing there was a hierarchy of power, right, from supranational banks to the private banks, governments, and the NGOs in this space. And so one thing that was really important for me, even starting that project to begin with, was being open to having empathy and being open to identifying with my interlocutors, because otherwise I knew I wasn't really going to be able to find or discover anything new. I wasn't going to be able to be open to other possibilities. Right. And I think in this book, they talk about hermeneutics of trust and suspicion, and how as anthropologists, we kind of go back and forth between trust is very important for our fieldwork and getting connected to the communities we're trying to learn more about. But then when we do attempts to put that in comparison to other communities or to a larger perspective, we use methods of critique occasionally, similar to like what you were talking about earlier in terms of how do we open up discussions in Western countries or open up perspectives on our ecological relationships. So I think it's very interesting to me in terms of, I think I've seen a lot of work that shows cases where sometimes the critique is too limiting. It's not really showing any avenue for alternatives. And there are obviously cases where there's too much full engagement and not an acknowledgement of other possibilities. But I find it's definitely a balancing act that I continue to struggle with.
Yeah, so you can fall off the straight and narrow on both sides,
Yeah.
What do you do? I mean, you're supposed to feel empathy when you're dealing with a mass murderer, I spoke once to the Secretary of State of Suharto before he died. I don't know, maybe he wanted some kind of confession of some sense of redemption. And I spoke with him for about 5 hours straight on all the goings on in the Suharto regime and the atrocities, and very difficult interview. On the other hand, I think of my farmers in Java who, wonderful people. And I must remember to be a little bit critical as well. And so say, well, is this really sensible what they're doing? But then I'm also being open with them. And I say, I'm not so sure about that. And they appreciate that.
Yeah, I think that's
not a useless professor hanging about who just watching. They want some input as well.
Yeah, so similarly for me, I think I get a lot more insight from work that is both critical, but then engaged in some form where it seems to also show that when academics do that, they usually have a higher level of understanding about the people they're actually studying and interacting with, right? Because then you learn, as you're saying, you learn from that quizzing, the quizzing that they have of you, and then vice versa.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for all of your time. It's a pleasure having you on. And I think we covered a lot of really great topics, from how your thought evolved in economic anthropology, what was kind of your career trajectory, how have your perspectives in fieldwork changed, how have you developed collaborations across disciplines and then with anthropologists globally. Is a lot of fascinating insights. And I'm sure all the economic anthropologists tuning in will be very interested to hear more.
Well, I hope it's of some use. Thank you.